is that Samson was just an ordinary man who did extraordinary things. But when the Spirit of the Lord was upon him, only then was he able to do his mighty feats. This takes me to John 15:5, one of my favorite verses in the Bible, where Jesus says, apart from me, you can do nothing. And then again, Jesus says in Matthew 19:26, with God, all things are possible. Really making it clear that we need God. We have to be fully dependent on him to do the things that he has planned for us to do. So let's take a look at Judges 15, verse 1. After some days, at the time of the wheat harvest, Samson went to visit his wife with a young goat. And he said, I will go in to my wife in the chamber. But her father would not allow him to go in. This is during the wheat harvest. We're going to come back to this in a few verses, so let's move on for now. The Bible says that Samson took a young goat. This wasn't of huge value. Samson was the one who had been wronged. The wife or her father should have been the one to make it right with Samson. Nonetheless, Samson makes the first move, showing us today that we don't have to wait for someone to make it right first. If there's a conflict that we're in the middle of, we can do our part to settle it regardless of who started it. Verse 2. And her father said, I really thought that you utterly hated her, so I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister more beautiful than she? Please take her instead. The reason why her father doesn't let him be with her as her husband in a marital way is because she's already been given to someone else in marriage. Then he offers his younger daughter, the sister. Not sure if the sister was more attractive or if the father, knowing that Samson kind of made these decisions based on what looked good to him, maybe Samson would say yes and take the younger daughter if he thought she was beautiful. But we have to remember that chapter 14 tells us that God was looking for a reason. God was looking for a reason to confront the Philistines. And he's using Samson's lusts and Samson's anger to bring about this deliverance of Israel. Still, at this point, Samson might seem to be an unlikely candidate to save God's chosen people, but God has a way of doing stuff like that. Back to Samson and this offer of the younger sister. Maybe he's just being prideful, or he's remembering Leviticus 18:18, which says, do not marry your wife's sister. Either way, Samson refuses this offer, and now he's seeking revenge. Verse 3. And Samson said to them, this time I shall be innocent in regard to the Philistines when I do them harm. He might have just gone and got revenge on the father-in-law and the man who took his wife. But because he is now a man with a plan who has to save Israel, he decides that this wrong hasn't been done to just him alone. This wrong has now been done to Israel as a whole. So he comes up with this plan. Let's take a look at his plan in verse 4. So Samson went and caught 300 foxes and took torches, and he turned them tail to tail and put a torch between each pair of tails. And when he had set fire to the torches, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines and set fire to the stacked grain and the standing grain, as well as the olive orchards. Samson's plan here is to burn up the fields. And since verse 1 tells us that this is the wheat harvest, we know it's around May or June, and the straw would have been really dry. Ruth 1:22 talks about this time of year as well. So his plan to set everything on fire is strategic. He knows it's all going to burn up pretty quickly, and he knows it's going to leave devastation to these people, but he also knows that he can't just start one fire. He needs to be able to set many fires all at once, so he does need help. But it's interesting because we never find Samson employing the help of anybody else. He's always working alone. Maybe he just couldn't find any other Israelites brave enough to help him with this plan, or maybe God just put it on his heart to work alone. But this doesn't mean that he won't use something else, and in this case, he's about to use foxes. This is a supernatural act in itself, just to catch 300 squirrely foxes, tie their tails together in pairs, tie them with a torch in there too. This is a crazy plan. So he gets them all tied up, and I can't even imagine this scene of these 300 foxes tied tail to tail with a torch there, confused, howling, squealing. They're ready to run away. And then Samson lights these torches and these foxes are gone. And let's look and see what was burned up. The first thing mentioned that was burned was the stacked grain and the standing grain. This is the corn. The second thing was the vineyards, which produce wine. The third thing was the olive groves, and this is what would make the oil. Now, the corn, the grain, and the oil were used in the offerings to Dagon. The Philistines made offerings to Dagon, which means grain. So they would take these offerings of corn, grain, and wine to the temple and offer them to Dagon. It's interesting that the destruction of Dagon's offerings right now is what's being burned up to God. This foreshadows the destruction of Dagon during Samson's last attack on the Philistines that we're going to get to in the next chapter. Verse 6, then the Philistines said, "Who has done this?" And they said, "Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he has taken his wife and given her to his companion." And the Philistines came up and burned her and her father with fire. Instead of taking vengeance on Samson for destroying all their fields, look at what they do. They go and they take it out on the now ex-wife, basically, and her dad. Think back to Judges chapter 14, verse 15. The very thing that this Philistine woman was afraid of, being burned to death, her and her household, was now being done to her anyways. It didn't matter that she helped them solve the riddle that Samson presented that they couldn't figure out, so she tricked him to get the answer for them. It didn't matter that she was kind of playing both sides. None of it mattered. She was now the subject of their destruction. And they're trying to get vengeance on Samson. It's not working. Because little did these Philistines know is that they were being used by God to bring revenge on their own people. Psalm 58, 10 and 11 mentions that the righteous are glad when they are avenged, not by God, but by their enemies. Verse 7, and Samson said to them, "If this is what you do, I swear I will be avenged on you. And after that, I will quit." He's basically saying, you think you're on my good side now? You think that I couldn't have just gone and burned her house down myself? So the small immediate picture is that Samson is mad over his wife being given to another man. But the bigger picture, the picture that Samson is now realizing, is that God is using him to begin Israel's deliverance. Verse 8, and he struck them hip and thigh with a great blow, and he went down and stayed in the cleft of the rock of Etam. The King James Version says that he smote them hip and thigh. The NIV version says he attacked them viciously. And the ESV that I'm reading from today says that he struck them hip and thigh with a great blow. We can assume these wounds were fatal because this phrase hip and thigh was used to describe a deadly wound. You didn't survive after that. After this, he goes to a rock or a cave called Etam, and he waited to see what the Philistines would do. What was going to be their reaction? He knows something's coming, and now he's going to wait. Verse 9, then the Philistines came up and encamped in Judah and made a raid on Lehi. And the men of Judah said, "Why have you come up against us?" They said, the Philistines, "We've come up to bind Samson, to do to him as he did to us." The Philistines go and they camp out in Judah. A little side note, this shows us that Judah is, for the most part, surrendered to the Philistines. Judah is one of the biggest tribes Israel has. So for the Philistines to come in and just kind of camp out wherever they want shows us who's in charge. It's the Philistines right now. And they bring this huge army because they know that Samson is as big as an army himself. So after the slaughter of their men, they gather even more Philistine soldiers to carry out this eye for an eye type of punishment against Samson. And they are mad. They explain this plan to the men of Judah, and this could have been a huge advantage for Judah and the Israelites. But let's see what happens. Verse 11. Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Etam and said to Samson, "Do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this that you have done to us?" And he said to them, "As they did to me, so have I done to them." 3,000 men of Judah go up to where Samson is, not to help him, but to tell him how unhappy they are with him, basically saying, "The Philistines rule over us. You made them mad. Now they're going to take it out on us. So thanks a lot." And Samson's response is basically, "And what?" This is why I say it could have been a huge advantage for Judah and the Israelites. This is a missed opportunity. Judah has a sizable army. 3,000 men. Add that to the power of Samson, and they could have made a pretty good attempt to take their freedom back from the Philistines. But they proved to be cowards. They proved to be afraid of the Philistines, as well as ungrateful to Samson. They seem to be content under this yoke of oppression from the Philistines. So instead of going to Samson to work together with him, they go to him to ask his permission, which is just so funny to me. They go to ask his permission if they can tie him up and hand him over to the Philistines, probably in hopes of getting back into some good graces with the Philistines. It seems odd that a good part of the tribe of Judah, the tribe which Jesus would come from, would be okay with this type of servitude to their enemy, and yet we can also be accepting of the chains that are so tightly wrapped around us. Because of their sin, God handed them over to be ruled by the Philistines. At this point, Judah has accepted it. They don't even try to break free, even when they have a chance. And for us today, our sin can lead us right to the hand of the enemy if we don't put God first. We have to be willing to see our sin for what it is. And our sin is always a trap. It will always bring our destruction. Our sin doesn't push God away from us. Our sin pulls us away from our Lord. But when we team up with God, like the men of Judah should have done with Samson, we can start to do great things, because with God on our side, that changes everything.